Hey everyone, welcome to another exciting episode of Get Scrappy. We've got a really good one today. Second, I could benefit from this one myself, so I'm really excited to chat about it. John Fontenot, welcome to the show.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
And I buried the lead here. We're going to talk about alignment, really critical for product managers, product leaders. I would say at any step in their career, any level. So, and I'm fighting through a little cold here, so sorry that I'm so scratchy with my voice. John, you're going to have to carry the load for us. But John,
Not a
thanks for
problem.
being here. We'd love to just learn a little bit more about your path into product management. Yeah, enlighten us.
Yeah, absolutely. So, born and raised in Louisiana, it's pretty much oil and gas or, odds and ends things that you're doing. So, finding my way to Utah was very serendipitous, where I met my wife traveling through college. I mentioned to you before we started recording that I picked up a teaching gig. It was like my first job out of college here. Very random story that I won't bore the listeners with, but I did end up becoming a contractor for Intel, which seems like quite a pivot from teaching, and it was. But I always wanted to get into business. I always had a fascination for technology, and I was contracting in their software group where I got exposed to product managers from multiple countries around the world, and just fell in love with what they did vicariously through kind of experiencing how they did their job. And I like to be in the middle of things, and it seemed like they were in the middle of everything. So I was like, how do I get there? And 2 years later, after bumping my head up against many walls and having many frustrations and hundreds of applications getting denied, I finally took some advice from a recruiter, joined a SaaS company as a salesperson, got mentored by a senior PM there, and then got a shot to start out as UX researcher and then pivoted into full-time product management from there. So it's kind of my story in a nutshell.
That's great. Yeah, some zigzagging there to get into product.
Absolutely.
I love it. Um, yeah, I share that with you in that just like to be involved in all sorts of different facets of the business, which is part of the reason I got into it as well. So, and I don't know if I've met anyone who's come from teaching originally. So that's really interesting too. But great to hear your story. It's always great to hear anyone's story in product because it seems like the path is always different. Um, cool. Well, again, John, thanks for being here. And we're going to cover what has to be one of the more important topics for product managers, alignment. You want to tell us why it's important to you and why you wanted to talk about it today?
Yeah, it's interesting. I spent some time a couple of years ago reflecting on my journey so far in product management at my previous company, I guess 2 companies ago, and then my previous company. And I started outlining some of the key assumptions that I made in my journey that caused me a lot of headache. And I like to write. I've always been kind of a quiet person growing up, and usually write my thoughts versus speak them. That's something I've had to grow in quite a bit. And I wrote a book called Never Assume. And the longest chapter by far, it was double the page length of any other chapter, was Never Assume You're Aligned. And I really started breaking down like my experiences in like what happened when I like what good came out of being aligned with those around me and my team, cross-functional partners, and what blew up in my face when we weren't aligned and what led to that. And that led to a whole journey of reading and researching and figuring out how to actually try to get aligned with people around me, which kind of led me to some of the advice that I have to share and kind of a framework that I use to make sure that I'm aligned in my own thinking and am in a good position to create alignment, or at least try to create alignment with cross-functional partners.
The idea here is to share tactical advice and wisdom. And I think you've already done that in the first few minutes here. Never assume you're aligned. I mean, gosh, I want to write that on my wall next to my desk. I've made that assumption. I've paid for it personally, just in full admission here. So what are some of how do you approach alignment then, right? Like what are some of the tips, tricks that you'd have for people to get over that hump and to get better at it?
Yeah, I think alignment really starts with common ground. I think a lot of times product managers bump their head up against roadblocks or friction, and that's why stakeholder management gets such a bad rap, because it's like, why can't they just get on board with what I'm trying to do? And what it comes down to in my mind is there's usually, not always, but usually in good companies that aren't toxic, a shared business objective where everyone can at least agree that as a business we're trying to accomplish this thing.
Yeah.
And so if there's no other place to start, I think aligning at the point of business objective and understanding what are the key challenges your head of marketing, head of sales, customer success, whatever, legal, finance, like what challenges are they facing? And like what problems do they see that are in your way to accomplishing that objective? And so I always say, like when I coach junior PMs, empathy isn't reserved for your customers, right? Practicing empathy with your internal partners is just as critical as practicing empathy doing user research. And so setting up those meetings, trying to gain an understanding and gain a common ground that, hey, we're all trying to accomplish the same thing. Let's figure out what they're feeling and experiencing to at least start there. And that's really where like step one of this process and framework that I built kind of starts.
That's great. So start with the business objectives, and then are you explicitly asking folks like what is blocking you from getting to that objective before you even go into the product material, the
Uh,
product management space?
when I remember to do this right, yes. I mentioned before we started recording that sometimes I forget to go through this process, and it takes time, and sometimes I get lazy. But when I do it right, it pays incredible dividends. And yeah,
Yeah.
to answer your question, absolutely. Like understanding one, making sure that we're not assuming that we're aligned on the business objective, because some people may
Yeah.
perceive the objective differently than others. So it helps there. But then once you're past that, it's like, okay, now we have a common ground to have a productive conversation. Like what keeps them up at night? Kind of that famous like executive question of always ask your leaders what keeps them up at night. I try to do that for all my peers or leaders across the organization.
That's great. That's so helpful. And then how does that bleed into product, right? So you got a business objective that we're all facing and heading toward. But then I'm guessing with the plans that the product team is making, is there another effort now to get buy-in across the org on the product plans?
Absolutely. So, in the same way that we should have a shared business objective, there's typically, unless it's a small company where the business strategy and the product strategy are one to one, there's usually like a vision, mission, objective, strategy, and then product strategy in bigger companies. And so, really, like the framework that I use takes a little bit of the OKR framework of objectives, which is where we started, and then it sandwiched in between. If you or your listeners have read Good Strategy, Bad Strategy by Richard Ramelt,
Yeah.
it's what he calls the kernel of good strategy, where you identify your challenge, or he calls it the diagnosis, and then you have a guiding policy for decision making, and then coherent actions. And so it really can be applied to any function. I've talked through it with marketing and with other groups before, but like the way I like to use it in product is, okay, we have this shared objective. I understand the perceived challenges across the org. Let me share with you the challenge that I see from a product perspective. And if we can get aligned on that shared challenge that we see, then it's like, okay, now we're on a common playing field. I understand your challenges, you understand mine. Now it comes down to the guiding policy. Okay, so marketing, sales, how are you approaching this challenge? Okay, let me share with you how I plan to approach, or how I'd like to approach overcoming this challenge that we see in product. Cool. Now we're still aligned on the approach that we have, and we can see, is there any dissonance between the two? Are we rowing in fundamentally different directions in how we're planning to execute at kind of like the strategic level? Okay, now we're aligned there, probably after a few conversations. Then the coherent actions part. This comes into the tactics, right? There's marketing tactics, sales tactics. Well, in product tactics, it really comes down to our roadmap, right?
Yeah.
What are we choosing to build or do through the lens of that guiding policy, kind of filtering our yes no decision calculus in order to overcome the challenge. And so if you spent the time to align on the objective, diagnosing the challenge, and getting buy-in on that guiding policy of how you're making decisions, then the roadmap becomes obvious, because they can tie back to, oh, well, John said he's making decisions this way, and this is why they're prioritizing at a high level this problem, and this is how they're going to approach solving it. So these pieces on the roadmap, they become more intuitive. And
Yeah.
so I've found that you get less questions and less pushback, because it becomes a coherent process that you've kind of walked them through.
Trying not to ask this in a loaded way, but I don't know any other way to ask it. It the trap that I've seen is a roadmap becomes a list of what's, right?
Yeah.
Features that don't, with the framework that you have in mind or that you're proposing, is it when you use the word intuitive, is your thinking that cross-functional teams are going to look at that roadmap and immediately know the why, or at least be able to connect what the product team is planning on doing and why that's going to matter for them because conversations have happened? I guess what I'm asking is this a way to get away from a list of features that might seem like a product manager's gut reaction?
100%. I think in companies in general, cross-functional partners have gotten used to seeing a team level roadmap of features and solutions. And I think where the shift needs to happen is that we start almost treating our cross-functional partners less like they're a developer on our team and almost more like an external party where we give them the right fidelity of roadmap, right? If we're sharing it roadmaps externally, it's usually thematic in nature of like here are broad themes of what we're doing. Saw a recent conference from Bubble.io, and they did a masterful job at this of like sharing a thematic roadmap externally. And I think bringing it down just a level of saying, okay, here's the themes, but here are the core problems we're solving. Like that's what sales and customer support and executives really care about anyway, is like what problems are you solving? Because then you could start like tangibly grabbing onto, okay, if this problem gets solved, I can see what that impact would be. And really like the focus shouldn't be on how we're solving it. It's the fact that that problem gets solved.
Yeah.
And so to your point, getting away from a features and solutions roadmap, you can keep that on your team as you're executing.
Yeah.
But what you're sharing with your other functions, I think really should be at the problem space level.
Love it. So another challenge that I've had is you can gain alignment and that's a conscious decision. That's okay. Next week I am going to set up these meetings and gain alignment. For me, and I'm only speaking personally, it's easy to fall into the trap of, okay, we've gained alignment. I'm going to go work with engineering and design and put my head down, go build the best product solution, in the world. But it could be, over time things change and it might be easier to fall into that trap of losing alignment. Have you seen that? And do you have any ways to overcome that? Any thoughts around overcoming that?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, there are so many pitfalls that could derail alignment once you get in execution mode, right? Like an executive could hear something at a conference and or read something on, HBR and like get this crazy idea of how we need to shift strategy and direction.
Yeah.
Or generally there could be some board level decision. There could be any number of factors that shift things and we don't hear about them until later, or it just fundamentally changes the direction that we're going as a business, right? Which would derail all of our execution plans potentially. So it's not, I think there's more efficient ways to get at it, but what I found to work best so far is just having a recurring meeting with a key group of folks at the right level of leadership, depending on your position and product, to be able to almost give like a readout of saying, okay, we did all this alignment work as a group. Even after you do like function by function alignment on the initial setup, setting up that recurring as a group to say, okay, here's what we're doing. This is a kickoff. This is kind of the first problem that we're solving, and almost kind of like a kickoff meeting. And that kind of sets the foundation for a few like follow-up meetings, that recurring. I like to do it monthly. So you can go over like, what are we learning? What did we learn in the last month? What did we do? How has that impacted the business? Is there data that we can show from usage, or is it a status update for where we're at in development? Either way, it's giving an opportunity for you to show some accountability and ownership of saying, here's where we're at, and letting people understand where you're at in the process, kind of bringing them along. But as you go, it gives people an opportunity to interject with their learning, which is great from a product perspective. Like I want data from every source I can get it from.
Right.
And so
Right.
it builds that platform for you there. And then it also allows people to say, oh, well, I heard this conversation from the EVP of marketing that like XYZ came down the pipe and that might impact things. Right. And you may not have gotten that feedback if you didn't have that platform to share what you're doing, what you're learning, and have other people, invest that feedback back into you.
Fair to say there's a hint of agile in that too, almost at a larger scale. You're kind of learning as you go.
100%. It's iterative alignment, I guess, instead of iterative
Yeah.
delivery.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that's great. The most successful I've seen our team do alignment when I was with Upland Software. We had 2 recurring meetings, and typically I'm not a fan of recurring meetings, but in this case it really worked. We had a product stakeholder committee, or I'm sorry, steering committee, in which we were, smaller group, just deciding on kind of what you were talking about at the beginning with objectives and how we were going to solve problems cross functionally. And then a much larger product forum, which was also monthly, and very similar to how you described it, bi-directional. So product and engineering would give updates on our progress. Maybe we've had to shift a little bit in how we were thinking about building something. Maybe the timeline has shifted or changed. Maybe we're early or late, right? Whatever it might be, we can share all that. And then the other team can share their feedback from the field, customer success, sales, marketing, what have you. And it worked really, really well. And it, in the last 10 minutes could also just be open for questions about other items that weren't tied to those objectives. So pretty easy and pretty effective in getting alignment. Anything else from an operational or mechanism standpoint that you would recommend people try and do?
Yeah, I mean, I think this problem needs to get solved more systematically, but I'd say just trying to be as organized with documentation as possible to
Yeah.
where when people have questions about things, it doesn't always have to be a meeting, right? And that could be something that as the PM kind of driving that meeting, you can reinforce, which each of the recurring meetings that we're talking about, of saying like, here's where all our documentation is, here's how it's categorized. If you need any information, here's how to get it at your fingertips. Because nobody likes having the same meeting 6 different times with the same question over and over again. But that's inevitably what happens if you don't have well organized and categorized documentation.
Yeah. No, it's critical. John Fontenot, thanks so much for being here. I think this is such an important topic that is important for our success as product leaders. So thank you for sharing. And if folks wanted to get in touch with you, is there a good way to do that? Or
Yeah, thanks for having me, John. I'm on LinkedIn. Feel free to look me up there. If you type in John Fontenot, there's not many of us out there, so I should pop up pretty quickly. I'm on Twitter for now at Product Font, so find me there as well. But for sure on LinkedIn.
Great, we'll link those channels. And John, thanks again. Really enjoyed having you here.
Thank you, John.